Alright, listen, doesn't everyone love a little love? Spider-Man writers sure do, or at least they used to. You've undoubtedly seen and heard a lot about the different characters Spider-Man has had a romantic relationship with, but when it comes to adaptation, there more or less always seems to be some issue in how they're translated from the page to the screen. The love interest that tends to get the most traction is Mary Jane Watson, and it couldn't really be any other way. If you're gonna do a romance story with Peter Parker, MJ is essentially the only option a lot of people can take seriously. They have one of the most iconic relationships in fiction. It should come as no surprise then that Mary Jane has the most amount of adaptations out of all these love interests. The animated series, the new animated series, Spectacular, Ultimate, Raimi, the MCU, Insomniac, they just keep coming. Given this amount of adaptations, I want to use her as a case study on why these things tend not to work, using examples for a couple of other characters along the way for clarification. There's two major groups of adaptations for Mary Jane. Most of them take inspiration from the 616 universe, the main Marvel continuity. This accounts for all of the ones being discussed in this video aside from the Insomniac games, the MCU, and Ultimate Spider-Man, which take inspiration from Earth 1610, the Ultimate Universe of the 2000s. The first major adaptation of Spider-Man and his supporting characters to discuss here is Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. These films are, above all else, overt drama pieces. Above the superpowered fighting, above the slight horror element Raimi injects into them, he ultimately understood that the reason that Spider-Man is so popular in the first place is because his comics were structured like a soap opera, taking the split identity of a superhero and tying them to relatable struggles for young people. Raimi leaned into that hard and made a really strongly elevated form of drama. Aaron Taylor wrote about the superhero genre's relationship to other genres in genre and superhero cinema. He essentially argued that superhero movies don't actually constitute a genre, rather elevating what other genres are adjacent to it. The superhero as a figure differentiates these films from others in its genre. Think how The Batman is clearly a noir detective thriller, but Batman being a superhero is fundamental to how that takes shape. The same is true for The Suicide Squad as a war movie, Jonah Hex as a western, and, of course, Raimi's Spider-Man as a drama flick. In creating this elevated dramatic world, Raimi takes characters from their comic context and makes them much more aggressive in some of their character traits. Throughout these movies, we see ideas being ripped from the comics. Peter moving in with Harry, MJ's abusive parents, Aunt May having medical issues, stuff like that. The difference then lies in the opening dynamic. In placing Peter, Harry, and MJ at the center, and their relationships being the core focus of the movies, there's a lot of extra pressure on them, making them act out in big ways. The extremely emotional ending of the first film and basically all of Spider-Man 3 are great examples of this. In terms of how this functions as an adaptation, there's a few complications. Firstly, Peter is still firmly the main character. Mary Jane and Harry both exist in the story to serve his story, and that's felt pretty hard with MJ. Her independence and focus separate of Peter is what allowed her to shine in the comics, so the lack of that time compromises her potential as a character. In the first film, this isn't too much of a problem given her relationship with her parents being strained and that accounting for a good amount of her story, especially with her dreams of becoming an actor being connected to that really naturally, but in the two other films, she doesn't get as much to do. What she does get to do is in large part in service of whatever Peter is doing at the time, whether that is being in a relationship with John Jameson or even realizing her dreams of being in a Broadway show. It's all undermined to build up Peter. Secondly, this elevated drama allows for really great big moments, but it makes the smaller, nuanced moments a lot more scarce. While Peter and Harry both still have the superhero side of their relationship, MJ is relegated to the social sphere, which only makes sense, but it means that her moments have to be very big, which is why she's randomly engaged or kisses Harry. The dumbest person you know will see that and be extremely misogynistic to MJ as a character or write her off because of it, but that is an inevitable consequence of how these films cast MJ. They play into gender tropes like the Scream Queen and Damsel in Distress, and that can work really well to highlight MJ's character traits that surround those tropes, but that's not how it ends up going in these films. MJ is a character that has gone through a few really big changes in the comics. At first, she wasn't really all that interesting. She wasn't a bad character by any means, but it took a long time for her to get the depth that makes her the character she is today, or rather, the character she was in 2007, the one people like. High-intensity events like the death of Gwen Stacy is where she really shines. That's where her character development comes from, and her growth is what people love about her above anything else. But it's not the big action where that comes from, it's the contrasting moments of silence where she shines. That's something that is really difficult to achieve in this context. Raimi had to make MJ a gripping character from the start to make the drama with these core characters work, and while she does undergo significant changes over the three films, it doesn't come close to the types of strides the character made in the source material. Notably, that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is 6 hours of film as opposed to decades of comics. The two can't be equivocated, and that is where the biggest issue with this adaptation lies. Time. A lot of the core principles of Raimi's Spider-Man apply to the original story. I'm assuming that's why he chose those principles. The overarching issue with Raimi's adaptation of Mary Jane is that he uses the superhero to elevate the drama genre, but fails to fully apply that to Mary Jane as well. Her inclusion in the superhero superhero aspect of the story can be messy and her own story is often compromised. The biggest factors that are missing for Raimi MJ to go in the direction of comic MJ are time and independence. Those two things, then, are exactly where Spectacular Spider-Man shine. Even with its cancellation after 2 seasons, there's still 26 20-minute episodes, much more time than the Raimi movies. While this version of Mary Jane didn't always have the focus, she was around for the majority of the show's episodes, and in terms of quality of adaptation, there's not much to criticize, because it's pretty one-to-one with the parts of the comics that they're adapting. It just so happens that that part is the weakest part of her history, before the big changes come that make her more than just the party girl archetype she was at first. MJ never becomes more than she was at first, and that's just not very interesting, and it fails to hit the big notes on what makes her a great character. Spectacular also has Liz Allen, Black Cat, Betty Brant, and Gwen Stacy. Liz is probably my favorite out of the potential love interests in that show, mostly because she actually gets major character development and has things to do throughout her time in the show. Especially when we get to the Molten Man story, she gets a lot to do and that makes her interesting. For most of its characters, this show sticks pretty close to what the original comics do, giving certain people more to do or introducing them earlier on, like the Lizard, Black Cat, and Liz Allen, all being more prevalent than they would have been at this time in the comics. In terms of characterization, most of them seem to be pretty similar to the source material. The biggest exception to that is Gwen Stacy, who does pretty close to a 180 vis-a-vis her 616 counterpart. After leaving high school, Peter encountered Gwen Stacy. It took a while before they actually started interacting for soap opera reasons, but they eventually started a relationship that became iconic and is still one of his biggest to date. So much so that Stan Lee considered it the definitive relationship for the book. It didn't take very long for her to get killed off after Lee left the book. There are a few major traits that made Gwen work, at least initially, in the comics that are absent in Spectacular. From her introduction in the comics, she was popular and had a bit of an ego, which put her in the mean girl category. She did eventually lose some of her personality in favor of being digestible for the audience, but that's not looked upon particularly favorably nowadays. She is, however, very opinionated when it comes to Spider-Man. She never really liked him, but especially after the death of her father, she hates that guy. And that's where a lot of the drama comes from for these comics. Spectacular's Gwen is not in the popular clique and doesn't take time to warm up to Peter. They kind of invert that, having her be close to Peter from the start and his Spider-Man activities coming in the way. She also doesn't particularly like Spider-Man, but she actually has valid reasons for that here. The biggest departure from the comics is the focus on science. She was always smart, which you can tell by the fact that she was at ESU studying the same thing as Peter, but the stronger emphasis on science seems to come more from the Ultimate Universe than 616. The biggest adaptation of Gwen Stacy is undeniably The Amazing Spider-Man. This, like Spectacular, takes much more inspiration from the Ultimate comics than 616. In those books, there is more focus on science in general, but given that Mary Jane got more time to shine, the connection between Emma Stone's Gwen and Ultimate MJ is hard to ignore. Her characterization here is not that close to Gwen in either universe, but again, does overlap with Ultimate MJ. The blonde MJ allegations are strong. There's still a few moments that are lifted straight from Gwen in that universe, like her confronting a bully, but MJ does that too, so it falls apart a little. Going back to the genre discussion we did for the Raimi movies, the first TASM movie doesn't really go into character drama in the same way. Instead, the closest genre we can find is the vigilante or urban crime genre that you see more with Daredevil or Batman. The superhero bit does elevate this, but that doesn't really apply to the character drama. The surrounding elements of Teen Pick are kind of left on the sidelines, not elevated in the same way. There is still drama, but that drama is left pretty normal. Gwen has tension with her dad, but not in any way that differentiates it from a normal coming-of-age story. The more extreme drama is around the deaths of Uncle Ben and Captain Stacy, both of which are framed more around the vigilante genre than anything else. It being at night, directly tying into Peter's ethos as a superhero, that kind of stuff. Similarly, when it comes to adapting these characters, it's done more for the urban crime thing than for anything else, which is why Gwen's role in this movie can be described as smart love interest without missing any major story elements. Funnily enough, the core issue that MJ faced in Raimi's movies, lacking time and independence, is exactly what keeps this Gwen from being particularly interesting. Emma Stone is charismatic, but when we put everything she does in that first film on a row, it turns out that all her major choices are just an extension of Peter, and she doesn't really have much of her own. Some things are implied, like her tutoring Flash and having a complicated relationship with her father when it comes to his job, but that never really comes to fruition because we spend most of the time following Peter. When it comes to adaptations of Ultimate Spider-Man, it's hard to not talk about, Ultimate Spider-Man. This show is weird in how it uses love interests because the target demographic is preteens. The genre being elevated here is action-adventure comedy with a little bit of drama, but because of the target demo, we just can't really do that much with love interests. This is very much appealing to the ew girls phase that a lot of young boys go through. There are still female characters, but the people watching this show don't want to see Peter be in a relationship, so there are no real love interests. That being said, Mary Jane is a major character for the first few seasons. They obviously took a lot from the Ultimate comics. They can't do most of the actual drama from those comics because the whole point there was to focus on how complicated the romantic relationship between a normal person and Spider-Man is. Instead, they made her a reporter. Now, this is technically accurate to the comics, as she does eventually do some work in news. However, no one likes this, and it doesn't have anything to do with Mary Jane as a character. That show wasn't the only thing to make MJ a reporter. That honor also goes to Insomniac's Spider-Man games. The biggest problem with her in these games is that she never actually felt like MJ. A lot of people have likened her to Lois Lane, and that's pretty accurate. Not just because she's a reporter, but also because her characterization and relationship with Peter mimic Lois's relationship with Superman. MJ in these games is vaguely girl boss and not much else. A lot of the conflicts between her and Peter is framed, at least from her perspective, as her being cool and right and Peter being irresponsible and inconsiderate, which just isn't very interesting, especially when MJ's wants contradict each other. In the first game, she really wants to be a reporter, putting herself in the middle of the action, but in Spider-Man 2, one of her reasons that she has pent-up resentment for Peter that comes out when she's Scream is that she doesn't want to be a reporter. That change can work, and I think it could be very interesting to frame it as a need to be in the action, but there's so many better ways to go about that, especially with the symbiote right there. The result of that is that she comes off as annoying and entitled. Like with the Raimi movies, the dumbest person you know will see that and be extremely misogynistic to MJ as a character or write her off because of it. The only way to address that issue is to have MJ actually act as herself and have the same flaws she had originally. There are real reasons for her and Peter to break up if that's what you want to do with the story. Him being protective of her is not one that makes sense. Unlike The Amazing Spider-Man, these games do apply the elevation to these different genres, elevating the drama as well as the action, but they falter with adaptation, not only making changes, but neglecting to maintain the core traits that made MJ work. The big adaptation we haven't talked about yet is the MCU, and that is a whole can of worms. Homecoming focused on Peter's relationship with Liz Allen, and after that they went pretty directly into MJ, who is called Michelle Jones for some reason. I guess it's to subvert expectations, a little twist scene at the end where we find out that this character who is nothing like one of the most iconic Spider-Man characters is actually supposed to be that character. Yeah, alright, sure. The biggest issue I have with the MCU Spider-Man, and this could be a whole video of its own, is the way that they use things from the source material. Throughout these movies, there's references to big moments like the final chapter and One More Day, and a lot of names for characters we know, but very few things that actually have anything to do with the comics. Sometimes that goes well. When they adapt storylines and make big changes to them, it generally works out. The final chapter is a nice moment in Homecoming, probably the best Spider-Man moment in the MCU, but it's immediately erased by Infinity War, waving away the growth he got from it. Similarly, people like the way that No Way Home approached One More Day, but of course they did. One More Day is commonly touted as the worst Spider-Man story ever. Comparatively, you'd have to try pretty hard to disappoint people for that adaptation, and the part that people like most about it is that it undid a bunch of bad decisions made throughout the MCU Spider-Man movies. Especially when it comes to the characterization of a lot of the main cast, these are nothing like they're supposed to be. They're original characters with the name stapled on. The worst offenders are absolutely MJ and Ned, maybe Betty as well. Even Peter's characterization is all out of whack, making his foremost traits being awkward and timid, which just makes no sense. But especially when we're talking about MJ, there's a good reason they didn't call her Mary Jane, and that's because there is a grand total of 2 traits that they share in common. One being that she's a woman, and the other being that she's a human. The dumbest person you know will see that and be extremely racist, and any normal person will recognize that this is just a writing issue. They could have corrected this at any time, given her an arc into being more outgoing, or making her current personality a consequence of an abusive household that she'll shed in the college era, which is what I'm hoping happens in Brand New Day, but they didn't yet. They even mentioned her parents, but didn't think to even imply anything about her relationship with her father. It's not missing the mark by accident like we see with the Raimi movies and TASM. It's not the story being cut short before we get to the good bit, like with Spectacular, or even an attempt to adapt a bad part of her history, like with Ultimate and Insomniac. It's just not trying. Where better adaptations, like Raimi and Spectacular, hold true to the concepts from the comics and apply them to their own worlds, Watts just makes a new, less interesting world and sticks the names from the source material on after. Ultimately, every major adaptation of Spider-Man's love interests fail in some area. This is in large part to do with how much time and independence they are given in the story, but the extent to which the creatives are concerned with staying true to the character is increasingly becoming a major issue. Brand New Day has a unique chance to fix a lot of the major issues with MCU Spider-Man and MCU Mary Jane Watson. That all being said, don't forget to point and laugh at the idiots using MJ's poor characterization for misogynistic or racist purposes, and have a good one.